Hello and welcome. Thank you for making it. It is good to see you here. So, tonight we're going to be talking about the space between or the challenges we have moving from learning information and applying information. So, from knowing to becoming. And this is something that doesn't usually arise when somebody is first getting started with anything, really. When we first get started, we usually need to learn more about whatever it is. We gather information, we start to study, we start to explore. But in personal development and in spiritual development, very often this happens when a person has already spent a lot of time really sincerely developing in themselves and putting time into their own growth. So they've read the books, they've attended the workshops, they received all the healings, they've explored various different things, they meditated, journaled, you name it. So they've invested deeply in this understanding of themselves and in the nature of life and spirit and all of that. In this, it's very often that someone has experienced profound insights, moments of awakening, and that this is, of course, very valuable experience. But then something often starts to happen. And people start to say something like, why do I still find myself reacting in ways that I've outgrown? Or why do I understand this so clearly, yet I'm not able to really live this? I'm not seeing consistent living of this in my life. And, or why do I feel like I'm kind of at an edge and I feel like there's more, but somehow I'm not able to expand into that more? So, why is it that this knowledge that I've gathered along this way not becoming fully integrated into who I am? And I think everybody asks themselves this at some point in time. I know I've asked myself it many times. Like, wow, I know a lot about that thing, or I know exactly how it should be, but somehow I'm not really getting it to click or be, be something that I'm living out. And I don't necessarily think that when we reach this point, that this is a sign of failure. And some people feel that way. They feel like, oh, look at me. I said I was going to, or I thought I was going to, or I learned all these things. And now that I can't make this change, I've either done the wrong work or there's something wrong with me or whatever it is. It starts to can turn back on the person a bit. And they might believe that they've somehow like missed the boat or missed the path. And instead of recognizing it as a developmental threshold, as a moment, as an opportunity, and that it's just really saying that what brought you this far, what you've been using, might not actually be what is going to move you forward. And sometimes we think, oh, okay, I'm stuck. I don't really know what to do. And what I'm going to talk about in this, I'm going to talk about this from two different angles. One angle is a little bit of, kind of, we call it psychological understanding, helping us see the frames like that, the map, the understanding of what it is that we might be moving through in and what might be going on from that perspective. And then I also want to zoom out and look at it from a certain type of spiritual lens and show that part of the picture because that is often the really missing piece. There's the missing piece of understanding, what it is that's in that gap, what kind of skills we need to apply. But then there are actually some other pieces that when they get brought into the equation, they really shift. They really shift the ground. They really shift what it is that's possible. So I think that at this point in time, like you could say you've reached a plateau, right? Not so much that you're stuck, but that's sort of, okay, wait a second here. I still want to keep going, but I'm not sure the way that I've been doing this is really working. Or maybe that's a good way, actually, a helpful way to start to look at it instead of there's something wrong with me. So when this, we could call this in this particular format like a plateau of knowing, right? So you've accumulated a lot of understanding. Maybe it's years of life, maybe it's study that you've done, whatever it is. You know about all sorts of things. You know about consciousness, you understand emotional patterns, you probably learned something about energy. You know the importance of forgiveness and presence and compassion and boundaries and purpose and authenticity. And you know the things, you've done the work. And but something is, right? Something is not making that change. So it's not, I want to just stop for a moment and say, I am, of course, and if any, if you know me, you know this, I am not saying that information or knowledge is, there's something wrong with it. So it really matters. Like knowledge matters, learning matters, healing matters, awareness matters, insight matters. All of those things are very important to our development. So it's not a matter of whether or not those things are valuable. It is really a matter of like time and place. Are they sufficient to what it is that we're trying to do? So, mostly we've kind of adopted like an assumption. And this came from our educational institutions, and then that just moved over into areas like our modern spirituality. And so we have this idea that if we understand something deeply enough, it will naturally kind of become it. And you can see this inside of therapy. People come to therapy and sincerely think that if they can just share what it is that's going on with them, then they'll change. And there is some change that comes from sharing our story and having it received or reflected back to us. But that doesn't complete the process. And people who have done years of therapy often say that, okay, well, I understand a lot. I understand exactly why I'm like this. But why is it that I haven't really changed enough for me? So a lot we know all the things. We know that we need rest and we need to eat properly. We need to speak honestly. We need to listen deeply. We need healthier boundaries. The list goes on, right? We should forgive more quickly and spend less time comparing ourselves to others, probably spend less time in our bad habits, trust ourselves more, right? Well, like all the things. And you can pick up any like self-help book or spiritual knowledge book or whatever it is, and it's going to give you a bunch of platitudes. It's going to give you a bunch of advice like, oh, trust yourself and love yourself. And those are wonderful reminders. There's nothing wrong with reminding ourselves of those things. But when that is like the steady diet and we're not seeing the actual transformation. Like we're not seeing the real change in our life. And sometimes we even lose the capacity to think or to believe, to know, to be able to imagine what is possible. That and we start to lose sight of that. We think, oh, okay, well this is as good as it gets, and so I'm just going to accept the fact that, yep, okay, I've done a pretty good job, but it doesn't really get better from here. I won't actually have more joy. I won't have more expansion. I won't have more vitality. I won't have more well-being because that's just it. It's kind of a downward road from here, or I can't go any further than this. So we know all these things, right? We might have various different relationships to the things that we know, but we're essentially we could ask the question instead of like what would help me become someone that who naturally lives what I know to be true. So how do I become that person that naturally lives what I already know to be true? And instead of getting caught in the traps that are there, and there's lots of them there, and so we want to get out of that piece of things and really start to move things. When I started to notice this, when I was doing therapy with people, and I started to notice where they were getting stuck and how they were getting stuck, that's when I started implementing coaching techniques. And this is just on a very like basic psychological level, right? I started implementing coaching techniques because I was like, if we don't actually start to shift people, then really what are we going to do? I mean, there's kind of like no hope here if we're kind of just talking about what it is, what the problem is. And maybe, saying, oh, okay, could be this, could be that, whatever. You can understand it, you can be empathized with, you can gain an awareness. Psychoeducation is important, but still, like until we start to move this out into our lives, then we really haven't started to see the true and full healing. So overall, if we look at it, when we're studying any kind of time you look at growth, you can see that it happens in stages, and every stage has its purpose, and every stage has its function or its gifts. And every stage is going to challenge us in some way or ask something different from us. So I want to put a framework together for tonight to set us up for the conversation and about different stages of our development. So what are we doing? What are we moving towards? How might we look at the trajectory that we're started on when we're talking about growth, when we're talking about progression? And really, when we're talking about psychological growth or spiritual progression, we're still kind of on the same evolutionary process. We're just now approaching it at a different level. And we really want to use the right tools for the job there as well. So that's one thing that gets confusing. Sometimes people they've done a lot of psychological work, actually. They're ready for spiritual development, but they're still trying to use psychological tools and they're not really getting anywhere anymore. Or sometimes a person has some stuff they need to go back and clean up, and the best tools to do that are the psychological tools. That's not always the case, but sometimes that's the case. So this map. So these aren't really meant to be like labels or a formal thing. This is a structure that allows us to talk about and understand what it is that I'm talking about. So the first stage is when we start seeking. So something compels us forward, right? Where something starts to awaken inside of us. We begin to ask our bigger questions. We have a sense that there's something more. Sometimes that's because sometimes we're dissatisfied in life. Sometimes we're just like, oh, this thing that used to make me happy or I used to think was satisfying is no longer satisfying. That can be the way that feels. Sometimes an event, a difficult event comes into our life, and it's just like, wait a second here, I missed something, and it pushes us to look for something more. Sometimes we're just curious. We're just somebody, I want to learn more. There's something I kind of went through all these different things. What else is there? Right? So in that phase, somebody might look at all sorts of different things. They might look at different traditions and philosophies and practices and teachers. And it's a very important phase of like opening the door. So without this curiosity, without this impulse, we don't actually start this process at all. But it's really an initiatory process. And what I am, by initiatory, I mean a beginning process. And what I'm going to point out here is that that beginning process, we often get stuck between this one and the next second stage, which is learning, which is that accumulation of knowledge. And we spend all of our time in those two places. looking, learning, looking, right? And so the second stage is where we can spend a lot of time. Right? And it can be paired very well with seeking. So where we study, attend workshops, read books, receive healings, we start to look for what's happening, what's happening inside of me. We start to understand things that maybe seemed outside of our realm. We might start to accept beliefs that are outside of what we would have previously thought about. Like sometimes people like would never think about energy, for example, and then they would start to be like, "Oh, okay, I understand this energy thing now." And they start to perceive differently. Sometimes people's psychic senses start to open up a little bit, and they're like, "Oh, wow, that my intuition is actually really strong. I can interpret things or intuit things that I wasn't able to in the past." But this process of learning is, of course, important, right? It gives us perspective and it allows us really to start to expand what it is that we know and understand what it is that has happened or what that we're perceiving. This is such a huge part of things. It doesn't go away. It's not like, oh, and then we abandon learning or and we move on never to learn again. No, learning is a continual part of the process. But when we don't actually pair it with some other things, that's when there is the problem. So when we're just learning to learn something more, we think that there's an answer that is going to like complete the puzzle for us. Or we think that if we gain one more piece of understanding, it's going to everything's going to fall into place. But the question actually at this point in time, once we've started to gather information, and this is where people very often don't do it, is this is the action. How do I actually live this? Because this is when the information moves from our mind into the our whole being into our life, right? So um when I want someone when someone says I want to work with other people, I want to become a healer, I want to help people or something like that, my go-to is you need a tool. Once you have a method, a technique, or a tool that you can then go out into the world with, now you have a means of practicing. So you want to have that means to practice because that allows you to start to really learn the information. So why do we get stuck here so often? Think about it. You go away to a retreat, you learn a bunch of stuff, you come home. You come home to your family, let's say. Your family has nothing to, they don't know anything about the retreat that you were just on. All of that is, outside of the realm of what it is that they understand. And you have this kind of new things that you understand, and you start to try and act differently. Oh, okay, well, I'm going to listen differently. Let's say you went to a retreat and you learned how to listen differently. I'm going to listen differently, right? And then you're getting weird feedback. Like maybe the person's like, why are you doing that? Or what's going on? Or maybe they don't, maybe they don't like it. Or, maybe they like it, but nothing changes. So this happens, and then the person, it's like then usually the process is arrested there. So the person tries and then they kind of run up against some walls. They don't see the change in their life, and then they get kind of stuck in that place. And that's where when we get on to a later part in this, when you move onto a path, you not only have the sequential process that allows you to move forward, you also have other dimensions of that process, including more people, places, and times to practice what it is that you're learning. When you have that, you have accelerated learning, we could say, or we could say also embodiment or becoming. So when you practice in isolation like that, I'm just giving you one of many, many ways that things don't work, why we get stuck here. But this is one of them, that we don't really have the components in place that keep us kind of working at it until we've got it. And when you have those people, places, and things around you, then it's very helpful. It's very facilitated. So when we learn about something, great, right? But then there's this point where we need to practice it until it becomes natural. And we can more easily practice that in a supportive environment than we can in a conflictual or an obstacle-full environment. That's not saying that we shouldn't try or that we should, it's nothing like that. Of course, we move in those areas, but that is one of the reasons that people get stuck in this particular. They either don't practice or they're trying to practice in environments where the bar is too high, they don't have sufficient support, or they don't have sufficient understanding of what it is that they're trying to do so that they can practice it on a regular basis. Right. So we need to have that opportunity to become, to practice. And this usually is like a little less exciting of a period. Seeking is like, wow, learning is like, cool. And then becoming can be like, okay, and let's try this again. We need to do this again. And that's also why it makes sense to have a clear sense of where you're going, and be able to know that you're on a consistent path of development, and to be able to look around you to people who have also done that, and can support you in your process of bringing these things along. This ultimately creates mastery. Whether we practice in a community or not, we're always practicing with other people because there are other people in the world. So we're always practicing with other people. However, regardless of where we practice, eventually, if we keep practicing at something, we will become masterful. Not perfect necessarily, but masterful. We'll know it very well. It will be much more lived and much more integrated. So you have an increased alignment, and it's less a mental understanding and more expressed in the way of being. And that's the easiest way for you to be able to tell like what's going on and where you are. Like, do I have a mental understanding? Great, good for me. I'm glad that I have that understanding. Okay, how does it show in my life? Where can I look to and say, this is actually the change that happened? I wanted to be more compassionate, and here's the results of that in my life. So each of these stages really has its own purpose. Like every, seeking awakens us, learning expands us, becoming transforms us, and mastery is going to stabilize. So, and really, like I was saying, none of them are, it's not just one, two, three, four. You leave a stage and you move into the other one. You can be working in multiple different areas. But there's a certain point where the balance kind of tips, where you're leaning more into mastery and less into seeking. So at this point in time, you're less looking for curious, looking for the new thing. You're invested in learning, you're invested in practicing, you're learning to bring in mastery. When you are emphasizing the seeking part of it, if you are still at the very beginning stages of it, your seeking will become learning, and then you can make the learning become becoming, right? But if you stay stuck on that, as some people do, even they want mastery, but they stay stuck in seeking, that will actually hold a person up. because they won't have sufficient practice or the sufficient types of practice to really become what they are wanting to become, and they might not even have a clear sense of what that is. And so that's another obstacle that's there. They might be like, "Oh, it's that. Oh, it's that. Oh, it's that." Instead of actually saying, no, this is what it needs to be. I'm going to follow this clear path. And then now I'm be able to be masterful. Think of it like instruments. Like if you were going to play 20 instruments and you started them all at the same time, unless you're some kind of musical genius, you would be very likely not to really learn how to play any of them. But if you start with one, or maybe you might be able to expand, say it's a string instrument, you might be able to expand to other string instruments easily, but you're still focused on that as a result of focusing on the violin, for example. You then are able to continue to practice and move that into mastery. So it's kind of how that process can work. So a couple things that we can notice inside of that, because there's a number of different things where like popular culture, media, ideas that get put out there in terms of our spiritual self-help, things like that. There's a number of different places where we end up getting caught, even though we're really well-intentioned and really want to see things change. So why is it that knowledge doesn't quickly become uh it doesn't quickly become who we are, right? And we're just talking about like why is it, and but I think it's an important question to ask because it's a little bit of a little understanding that allows us to start to get into this a little bit more. Information involves the mind, right? And knowledge is incredibly valuable because it expands our perspective. It helps us recognize patterns. It gives language to our experience. Sometimes like a single insight can change our perspective on something forever. And that really matters. And sometimes people can't really move forward because they have insufficient understanding. They actually have insufficient knowledge. That's why education exists, because it's like sometimes exactly what you need is more information. So it's not saying, oh, that's not important. It's recognizing that mental, it just happens in our mind. That's all that happens. So what changes is our understanding. So our job actually is to bring that out into the world, right? Without bringing it into the world, all we have is something that exists in our mind. And as we all know, we can change our mind quite a bit. We can look at things from a million different perspectives. We can remember and we can forget. We can do all sorts of things inside with the mind, and it doesn't necessarily change anything. So I could be like, right, you can be really angry at somebody and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm not angry at you anymore." Right? So our mind constantly changes. So when we bring new information in, we have new insight. Fantastic. It's wonderful to have new insight. And also, um, we have seen nothing really change around us. So this includes everything, right? Our emotional patterns, our habits, our nervous system, our unconscious responses. Everything is basically the same. In fact, particularly when it comes to the nervous system, our nervous system is slow to change. So we can, resolve in our mind a trauma that happened, but our nervous system still needs to actually be deactivated and be able to learn to work in another way. So similarly, in what I was saying, right? If you think about like playing an instrument, if you read every single book on musical theory and you understand everything, you understand scales, you understand harmony, you understand every note, right? But you can't play, right? Because that playing isn't built on the information. It's built on the applied behavior or the action. And you can't actually know what that's like until you do it. So when therapy works, one of the things it does is it allows people to practice new behaviors. And then in practicing those new behaviors, they start to be able to go, oh, I can do that. I can do that. All right, I can do that. So in a spiritual sense, though, when we start looking at things from a spiritual level, it's not always so easy to understand how we might practice. It might be like, oh, well, I want to have better communication skills, right? And so you role play good communication skills, right? But when you're taking something like, I want to be a more just person, I want to bring more peace into the world, right? Sometimes it can get a little bit more challenging to figure out exactly how that's done, exactly what that might look like. I want to feel energetically more vibrant. So we need to learn how to bring our whole self into this experience. And again, the more concrete things are, it's helpful to talk about things on the concrete side of the spectrum, like playing music, right? Because when we talk about playing music, we can go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then we can inch ourselves along the spectrum of things. We could look at kind of psychological understanding. All right, that's a little bit different. All right. So it's starting to understand, right? I want to be, I might have a goal inside of it to be a more, to create more connection, right? Okay, now I can start to look at what does that look like? How do I break that down into skills, that kind of thing. When we start getting into spiritual development, we get into these broader concepts that we need actually perception, like certain types of understanding in order to actually even unpack what they mean and not be led astray by some of these deeper concepts. And then we're also talking about shifts on a whole different level. So that moves into an entirely different type of shifting that happens inside of the person, an entirely different type of becoming that isn't like it's not that it's different. It's a different, well, you have to kind of perceive it slightly differently. So very often people don't know how to practice that or what that means or how they become it, how they move into it. And there's different levels to this, but there's certain levels to it that really can only be attained through initiation, through the actual shifting of the energetic structure, which then allows the person to be and act and practice at a different level, which then allows all of the things to be able to shift. But there's much change that happens outside of that as well. So we need to be able to live this, shift this, understand what it is that we're shifting. And very often people don't know. Let's take something like, okay, I want to lose weight. All right, I want to lose weight. So I know that I need to exercise more, most likely, and I definitely need to eat less calories because somehow I need to have less calories in my system in order to lose weight. That's the name of the game. There isn't, you can exercise more to do that, or you can eat less calories, right? So know that I need to do that, but somehow I'm not losing weight, right? You could say, oh, maybe it's a glandular issue, whatever. Yes, maybe it is, right? But we're going to leave that one out of the equation. So there's some way that I need to lose weight, or I know that I need to cut calories in order to lose weight. But somehow, even though I think I'm doing it, I'm not doing it. Maybe I'm even looking at how much am I eating. I think I'm being really good. I'm like, gosh, this just seems like such a small amount of food. I'm paying attention, that kind of thing. And why is it that it isn't happening? And usually that's because there's something that a person is doing unconsciously that they're not aware is affecting the situation, or they're not even aware of it enough to take action on it to change it. And so that piece never gets practiced. And then because it doesn't get practice, the person's going through what they think is the whole sequence. They're trying to do it, but they're not actually getting the results. And this is where we need outside perspective. So it's very hard for us to see into these areas on our own. And part of, and again, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but part of what like lineage teachings do and guidance does, spiritual guidance does, is it gives us some of that perspective. It fills in. It's just like, oh, now you can see A, B, and C that you weren't doing that was making it so this wasn't happening for you. It wasn't moving along. So those are usually it's outside of our awareness what it is that we need to do. Even if we're like, I know everything I'm supposed to do, I'm supposed to eat less calories, still something exists outside of our awareness. Like maybe it's how to manage our cravings. Maybe it's an emotional component that compels us to eat, right? It could be all these different things that are in there that are stopping us from practicing in the area that we most need to. Again, that's why when you have a comprehensive system that goes through every single piece, it points out those things and you're like, oh, I get it. That's what it was that I wasn't doing. Now I see. Now I see that that thing that I thought was just like, just a few calories is actually half my calories for the day, right? So we start to gain that understanding, but we need something to work with in order to be able to do that. So we go through different levels of knowing, right? The first we have the information, the second we have the understanding, we start to grasp the concept, then we get to integrate it, and then we start to embody it. Right? And when we get stuck in these places, it's often because we don't know, right? We don't know what it is that we need to do in order to really make that order, that pattern, that movement, that process happen. This is true in absolutely every area of life, right? So this is why coaching is so helpful. Coaching is pretty much a process of doing that. Let's find a way that this works, right? Let's find a template for how this works. And then let's see how to recreate this template for you as an individual so that you are able to get the results that you want to get, right? So we always look at what works. How does that work? You want to be in really good shape. You look at the person. How did they get to be in really good shape? You might be like, I don't want to do that. I'm not willing to, whatever it is. Yes, sure, that's totally fine. But there's a pathway to get there. And you can get there. You can get it by seeing how someone did it. And if you look out in the world, not everybody has your problems. And I always think that's amazing. Whenever I start to feel stuck, I just look out there and I'm like, okay, like look at all these people. They don't have this particular thing. Therefore, there's some way to figure it out. That's agency. That's empowerment. That's when we start to recognize that no matter what we are facing in our life, there's some way. And what we usually can't do is get out of our way enough or get enough perspective to be able to see what are the sticking points. What am I not seeing? What is that one thing or those three things that I'm doing that are keeping me stuck here? And then, go back and say, okay, well, maybe I just need to, whatever, learn more, go on a different type of diet, what, like something, right? Maybe I need to do that. Maybe I need to, work out 10 more times a week. Whatever it is that you come up with that we're going to put it in terms of spiritual development, maybe it's because I need to develop this particular aspect of myself. Or sometimes we say things like maybe it's because I'm not meant to do something like that. That happens too. So we want to understand that what gets stuck is that we're in the place where we need to practice in order to take that learning and bring it into life. And usually we have some kind of incomplete process that's in there, or there's something that's either missing or flawed in our equation. And we don't know how really to get at it. So then we start to ask the question, okay, like what actually really does this? What helps us do this? What helps transform a person? This is like my lifelong question. I've asked this my whole life. What actually helps? Like, why have I changed where I've changed? Why sometimes do people not change? What helps them be able to do it, right? The philosophers asked it, the mystics asked it, religious traditions have talked about it. Psychologists are always asking this question, right? Not just in a superficial way, but in a deep and fundamental way. And how do we become different people? How do we leave the past behind? Not in a sense of I want to bury that and never have to deal with it again, like, like I want to run from my past or something like that. But when are we able to just simply put it down or leave it, have the healing be complete? Move on into being something else. And that might seem very simple, but it is a very deep thing because people struggle with it because somehow it seems like it's not allowed. Like, oh, me, I'm allowed to like put down, the grief and the trauma and all of this kind of stuff and just like start becoming something totally different. Start moving into an entirely different way of being. I was like, oh yeah, 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 I want that. I want that. I want that. But somehow we still like kind of hold on to those pieces in the past because it almost doesn't seem possible to just let them go and say, okay, right? That's what was. Today, I'm working on this. Today, I'm moving forward in this way. I'm not pretending that didn't happen. I don't have to do anything with that. I don't have to pretend anything. I don't have to repress anything. I can just simply show up to this moment and I can say, and this is how I'm living into my next steps. This is what I'm becoming. This is what I'm creating for myself. So, right. In what we see is like when we start to get close to this, sometimes people they start having these kind of like expansive, contractive type experience. They break through one day, right? And then they're just like they're back at their old patterns, right? They kind of expand. They're like, oh, I got it. Yes, I'm free. I'm, able to move forward, all of that kind of stuff. And then they're like, okay, and I'm gonna do it. It's like, but they don't have those components in place to really be able to develop that becoming. They just had insight. That's why we have to use tools that move beyond just insight. Insight tools are going to be insufficient. Always. It's not like they won't change us at all. They will just always be insufficient. So we have to move beyond just insight and start to be able to this process of becoming and starting to see how we can move forward. What is needed for us to move forward? And usually we need a combination of various different things, as we're starting to move through this process. So we need our awareness, right? Which sometimes comes in the form of learning, but sometimes it is in the form of our unconscious becomes conscious, right? So what helps us be able to see what we were no longer able to see? How do we finally notice where those calories are actually coming from? How is it that we become aware of the fact, oh, that's what I'm doing, that's making this happen? That's the piece of the equation. How do we start to become aware of those various different pieces? Like, why does this relationship keep unfolding the same way? Why do we keep going down the same and have like going in the same pattern? Maybe, why is it that I seem to be repeating this pattern from childhood? We want to see that. We want to see what it is that makes us, um, why we're doing something. But again, this is insight. This is a type of insight, but it's still very important to the transfer. If you can't see into those places, if you can't see the whole thing, you're only going to be able to get so far. Right? And as I was talking about, healing is another part of the process. So we need to actually have some mechanism or tool or tools or ability to clear out the past and resolve the pain. Now, the problem is that most of our tools actually have us focusing on the past and reliving the pain. We're actually becoming more embedded in the wounds along the way. And that is what we call healing, like 80-90% of the time. When someone says, I'm getting healing done, what they're actually doing is they're embedding themselves. They're deepening into the pain that they have felt in the past. And in various different ways. So really important that healing becomes defined as those things that allow us to clear the past, or pain, suffering, difficulty, negative energy, anything that we want to call it, and allow us to move more fully into the present moment. But it doesn't, as I said, present moment, it doesn't establish, healing doesn't establish a new way of living, right? So we heal, but we don't have a new life. So the new life is where we practice. Right? But we need those components. We need to have awareness. We need to have healing before we're able, and then we need to practice. The practice then becomes the embodiment piece of things. So none of these, all three of these are necessary. All three of them help us with this process of becoming. All three of them are going to help us cross that bridge. Um, but the key inside of all of that is that we are able to um, uh, live into or create into places that we were otherwise unable to go into. So awareness doesn't help us if we loop into the past. Healing doesn't help us if we loop into the past. It only helps us if we are able to then say, okay, that's where I was going off the tracks. Now let's course correct and move this forward in a different way. And if we spend too much time there, we actually also don't get results. So if we get stuck, oh, I need to heal, I need to heal. Oh, I need more awareness. Oh, I need more awareness. We get stuck. Too much of our energy is going backwards. And we need to actually move more of it into what it is that we want to create. One of the things that I want to look at this, I was telling you, I want to look at this from a spiritual perspective a little bit, because I think that it provides a unique perspective. For myself, having studied healing my whole life and being adult life, in being understanding or looking at where the limitations of approaches were and the difficulty in really truly bringing about like real healing, not just helping people feel better, but bringing about real healing. Um, I started, in that process, I started to say, okay, like this is what is possible. We can change quite a bit. I felt like I had changed quite a bit. So we can do that with a lot of the psychological methods, with a lot of different healing methods. We can start to see a lot of traction. But when we bring spirituality into the container in a very or into this way of working, when we bring it in a specific way, I'm not even just talking about just general spirituality, but then we start to get a whole different type of result. And there's lots of reasons for this. And this is so it's really fascinating because what happens is we take the piece where it's just like, okay, if you listen to everything that I said and you start to apply some of that understanding, you can get yourself pretty far. You're not going to loop as much. You're going to start to see some really good transformation in your life. You're going to feel like you're growing. But what actually takes that to an entirely new level and raises our overall capacity in life and allows us to have a much like faster perspective and even to be able to heal more rapidly are actually some of the shifts that we can bring in from the spiritual perspective. And that's not because it's like make believe kind of, it's not like a law of attraction kind of thing or something like that. It is, it's an addition. It's like a developmental addition to the system. It works in a very, like in this stuff works in a very specific way, right? So we know that knowledge isn't really enough. And we know that transformation is something that we need to practice. And this is where, when we start to bring in lineage teachings, deeper spiritual practices, practices that have been preserved throughout time, they have a dramatically different and powerful impact on our system. And because the lineages who are all asking those questions, how can we help? How can we uplift humanity, so to speak? So the lineages not only preserved the teachings or a particular tool, but also the processes by which people are transformed. And the processes are actually multidimensional. And they contain components that are not easily and sometimes can't be even at all translatable into other systems. And that's often why they're called mystery, like mystery schools, mystery traditions. It's not so much like an air of secrecy. Yes, sure, sometimes that was totally appropriate, and that can be appropriate. But there's also something to be said for the fact that some of these things can't fully be explained inside of another system. They are additional to it. That's where you have like the hidden knowledge, the esoteric knowledge, right? So this is these are additions that help people in the process of becoming, to help them be able to realize their full self, to move from knowledge into living a wisdom. So, and why? I mean, you like think about it just for a second, but people become like if you see something works, right? Like that is and then it's refined and refined over time, then that is something that will people will keep, right? That is something that people will uh allow to like they'll keep on repeating it. They'll say, okay, that worked. Let's go ahead and do that again. Let's keep that piece of things, right? Because they're going to allow those that knowledge to come forward. So of course that knowledge and that way of working would be worth preserving, right? Because it's like, okay, well, there's certain tools, there's certain practices, there's certain processes, there's certain things that add on to what commonly understand. And we've seen that these things have great results. And so we're going to keep doing them and we're going to preserve them as practices, as tested pathways for transformation. And then that is something that we are able then to continually pass down, right? So there's kind of two components that I'm putting out here. One is that idea of we've seen what works and that is what it is being passed down, right? The other component is that these are beyond, these teachings are, or practices or ways of doing things are beyond the system that we are used to working with. In that, they add an entirely different component. They help us with our becoming. So the structure helps us to be able to learn, grow, persist, use something that works in the same way that I was saying, well, when you want to lose weight, there's that, you need to figure out what you're doing. Or when you want to exercise, you need to figure out what you're doing. You might want to look at someone who's figured it out. They might be able to explain it to you the best, right? So there's that component that it keeps that piece moving where we're like, oh, okay, somebody figured this out. I can probably learn, even if it's not exactly the same for me. I can learn from this person to keep this moving, right? So there's that structure. And then there is also what it is that we can't fully explain. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want to say a couple more things. So we're also practicing inside of an environment, you could say. It's not necessarily just an environment like a room with four walls, but you're practicing in an environment that naturally starts to show you where you have those holes in your becoming, where what you're not getting, where those extra calories are, where that practice is that you're not able to, that you're not bringing in, and therefore you're not getting the result. So the system, structure, community, whatever you want to call it, environment allows for that to happen. Regardless of how you're in relationship with it, of course, it varies how it influences you, but it gives a lot of perspective and it gives mirrors and accountability, right? And it allows us to see the way that things can work. So all of that is incorporated into a system like that. But in case in point, and what I was talking about, the energetic structure, there is the role of initiation. And, for some people, that might seem like just a simple ceremony or a milestone or something like that. You're entering into a different relationship, you're a conscious commitment, all of those things, new responsibilities, all of these things are true. However, more importantly, the initiation creates a shift in the energetic structure, and that energetic shift allows for greater integration and progression. So it actually provides a shift beyond what is possible in other ways that allows for greater integration and progression, which allows basically a person to be able to incorporate more of what it is that they're learning and to be able to see how to use that in practice. Like I said, it's multidimensional, so there are other aspects of that that are happening, but allows them to be able to see that in practice from a new perspective, which then allows them to be able to move forward. And because of the fact that there is a path, there is then an ability to see where some next steps might be. And that allows for greater growth overall. Because it's been tested over time, you can guess that more often than not, those steps that you're seeing are ones that have worked and may work for you. With varying degrees, kind of depending on what it is that you're looking at. But those things all help in the practice component, which moves us closer to mastery. It moves us, but it definitely puts us strongly in that place of becoming and embodiment. So these things exist really because we've been asking throughout time, like, how do we become what we know? How do we live what we, have learned? And we need the tools that actually allow us to do that. So there are certain tools that actually will allow us to be able to turn that wheel or take that action more. And I presented some of the psychological tools, perspectives, and orientations, and then added to that the spiritual dimensions, which are in addition to those foundational ways of working. But there are many different things that are brought into the mix, through a well-held lineage. And that is like, there's protection for the integrity of the work. There's like a preservation of the sequence of study. There is, a recognition of like responsibility and a really holding and building in of responsibility into the mix. There's many different things that are in addition to that that help to hold that process of becoming in a way that it really, is powerful and the most can be gotten out of it. So that brings us kind of the final step in this. I'm going to be wrapping up in the next couple minutes. So, how do we know when we're ready for a certain type of work, right? And like, where do we look for signs that we're ready? So, recognizing this shift, what helps us sort of see that maybe, okay, maybe I need to start moving, I need to start practicing more. That's where my emphasis needs to be. Every day my emphasis is on practice and how can I actually create an environment or be in a way that is going to help me practice as much as possible. And so often, if we're looking for change, there's kind of patterns that start to emerge. And one is being less satisfied with the way that we once did things, right? We might really still enjoy learning and good ideas and something like that, but we just sort of get a little bit like, I'm just kind of done with that piece of things. I want to live it. Some people just say, I just want to live, actually. And they're saying the same thing. I just want to live. I just want to live it. And it's like, oh, okay, what you're saying is like you kind of hit saturation point, and there's a need for integration and action in life at this point in time. And another thing that you can become less interested in kind of extraordinary experiences. Those kind of experiences might become really important, our opening psychic perception or our synchronicities and things like that. But then we might, over time just say, okay, it's not really what I'm looking for. I'm kind of certain about my direction and my spiritual connection and all of that. I want steadiness and alignment. I want progress. I want all of those kind of things. And so at this point in time, we're really starting to ask, like, how do I become the person that really lives these things that I learned? I'm convinced. I'm convinced this is who I want to be. How do I take action in this in my life? And that can also come, the kind of shift at this point in time can come with a sense of valuing things differently, right? Instead of valuing novelty, valuing depth. Like instead of just being inspired, really liking consistency, really, knowing like liking teachings that like help apply, help embody, help practice, right? So we start to shift in that way as well, like just kind of our values around what's important. So I don't necessarily think that it's about you know, like, oh, okay, I've learned this or I've seen this or now I've attended this webinar or whatever it is, and now here's this next thing. It's really about listening to yourself. And the importance, or what I was trying to describe in tonight, is to be able to listen to yourself more completely and to be able to hear or see or feel or sense those places where maybe, the emphasis, the energy, the focus is going in a bit of the wrong direction, or maybe in a less helpful direction, meaning it's not really getting the results that you want it to get. So at that point in time, it requires the humility that we're willing or able, that we're willing or able to be like, yeah, okay, I'm actually not seeing the kind of change here that I want to see, and I'm ready to do something about it, right? And if you're not ready to do something about it, that is totally fine. I mean, that's a fine decision to make. That's being honest with yourself. But, when you get to that place where you're like, yep, this is it, and I'm ready to do something about this, right? Then okay, I'm really trying to figure out how I can bring this into practice. What are the things that are going to help me practice it? And so if you are looking for a next step, you can absolutely sign up for a discovery call with me. You can find that through the Sacred Lights website, or you can go to sacredlights.com getting started. Either one of those will bring you to a discovery call. You're welcome to sign up with one of those, figure out what your next steps are, if you are ready for that point. If not, there are lots of things that you can do in this particular moment in time. It's really just attuning your process and your development to where you are. So the question isn't really about like, am I ready? It's more like, what is this life asking me to become? Right? Because there isn't one objective from life. It's our own, we're moving in a certain direction. We know what it is that we need. We know if we're needing to increase our alignment with truth, or to live more embodied, or to practice more. And if that is where you find yourself, then I hope that this has given you some understanding, a little bit of a map, some language, that kind of thing. And to close out for our night, I want to leave you with a reflection, and take a moment and consider something you've known for a really long time. Anything that you've known, a piece of wisdom, something you've known you've needed to change. And then ask yourself, if I truly embodied this, how would my life look different? And I hope you find the courage, the tools, the strength, the fire to move that forward in your life. Hope you have a good rest of your night.